Hello, and welcome to the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. This podcast is designed to provide that momentum in our God-given roles of leadership as we partner together to equip today's Christian leaders for tomorrow's opportunities. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome back to another episode of the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. We're so glad that you tuned in and clicked play. I'm your host, Eric Miller. We have with us Dr. Jeffrey A. Bogue.
Hello, Eric Miller.
How are you?
It is me.
Are you glad to be here today, Jeff?
I am glad to be here today.
The sun is shining and the weather's warming up. It's a good day.
Yeah, it's a great day. I was actually talking to a friend last night, and I said, I see God doing so many wonderful things. For me right now, there's just a ton of joy in life because I see God working in people's lives, in my family. And then it's one of those times where you've invested a lot, and then I'm having the joy of watching people, the light bulbs come on and them get excited about Jesus.
Yeah,
I'm like, this is fun. you know, it doesn't happen every day, but I'll certainly take it for a while. It's a reward. So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here, Eric.
Summer is here, and I'm thrilled that we get to have a summer of ministry. And that for me is super exciting. So
see, that's the thing.
Having that same thing play out in our ministries over the summer. Yep.
We're gonna meet later on today about Momentum Youth Conference, and that's a blast to talk about that stuff. So yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, I'm excited. Well, if you're listening to this episode and you're not joining us for any of our Momentum ministries that happen over the summer, I'm just saying you're missing out.
Saying, people.
Just saying. All right, let's dive in to our topic here today, Jeff. I was looking back, and we've not really tackled this topic, and yet it's something that probably every church, every family is thinking about, mindful of. You kind of can't escape it. We're going to dive into the conversation around same-sex attraction. I just saw this a couple weeks ago. The CDC actually put out data from a survey that they had done in 2021 that found, Jeff, that 1 in 4 teenagers now identify themselves. It's not like I'm wrestling with or I've had the thought, but they're now identifying themselves as either homosexual or bisexual, and they're wrestling with that. They're questioning their sexuality in a significant way.
Yeah,
1 in 4. The number of LGBTQ plus people continues to rise every year. That's a proven fact. We'll even in the show notes link to that article for people if you're curious and you want to go and see that research and read more about those numbers. But Jeff, what are some of the factors that we're seeing that go into this number continuing to rise and increase?
Well, I think there's a bunch of things. When I look at that CDC number, this is the thing that I would say. One, I always remember that those CDC and other organizations that publish this data do have agendas. And so I'm always aware that there's a slant and they're reporting and a bias to it. Now, that being said, the idea that 25% of teenagers are now identifying as, and the sentence is, as homosexual, bisexual, or are questioning their sexual identity, that being large and that being growing does not surprise me. Whether or not I trust the number or not is irrelevant. It does not surprise me. And I think when you look at that, the largest majority of that, we'll just go with that 25% number, is the questioning majority. And so these are young people, high school, college, even junior high students who are questioning their sexual identity. Now, you asked me, why do I think that is the case? A couple things. One, I think they have been taught to question their identity. So it's kind of something they would say or wrestle with or think about that they wouldn't do naturally. So they're kind of being taken to that place and they're questioning it. Secondly, I think that what we're seeing is we are seeing the end result of what is now 2 decades of sexual abuse, which is what pornography is.
Yep.
So when you look at a lot of transgenderisms and sexual identity issues 20 years ago in the DSM-4 and in the DSM-5, that all of that would have been categorized as gender dysphoria. And it was classic evidences of sex abuse. When someone believed they were of a different gender, it was just the classic result of sex abuse. So what's happened in the last 20 years with the invention of the smartphone is that we as a global community, planet-wide, are sexually abusing our own kids with the free, unfiltered availability of pornography. If what a kid can watch on their phone, if in the United States, if that act was done in person, the people doing that act and the one who exposed the child to that act would be in prison for life.
Yep.
It's child abuse.
Yep.
Because it's so available and so secretive on the phone, a child, usually by the age of 7, has started to see sexual activity that they are not prepared for, that their bodies are not for, their mind, their brain chemistry and their emotional makeup is not prepared for, and their brain chemistry and their emotional makeup is deeply affected and altered. It's because it's sexual abuse.
Right.
So you're seeing that play out. So when a teenager has the average boy sees his first pornography by the age of 7. So now you're 14. So you've gone through 7 years of sexual abuse. Of course you're going to question your sexual identity, and of course you're going to struggle to understand all of that.
Yep.
So it is a byproduct. Now, I say that whenever I say this, everything I just said, I'll get lots of heat for it, and I'll get lots of "you're kind of old-fashioned," and I will kind of look and say, I understand, but we cannot deny these facts. And you pull those facts out of the equation, then what you'll see is this mass response.
Right.
There has always been sex abuse, and there has always been pornography, and there has always been access to prostitutes, etc. That stuff is timeless.
Right.
It has never before in the history of man been global, in mass, free, accessed at will, and then secretive. I can erase the footprint that showed that it was ever on my phone. Yeah. So it's a totally different dynamic, and we're seeing that dynamic then play out in these statistics.
Jeff, I think that's so good to put in that perspective, because do you think it's true? Like we become calloused to these things. We've desensitized ourselves so much that we don't even realize that that's a thing or an issue. Like I have friends who love horror movies, and they're constantly like, what's the next one that's coming out? Yeah. And I'm like, I get scared by the Wizard of Oz and like the monkeys. Like
maybe a different issue.
Sure. But like when you constantly like fill your mind and your heart with these things, you become calloused. You lose that sensitivity to those things. And I think we can see clearly that's where our culture is at.
I think when you are a discipled, mature adult, I would use that phrase, that you become calloused. When you are an undiscipled, immature child, I would say you become wounded.
That's good. Yeah.
And abused.
Yeah.
And it you can everybody can probably tell I feel strongly about this.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm like, who is advocating for these children? Yeah. That we're throwing them kind of to their own demise. Like we're looking at a 7-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 14-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 20-year-old, and saying, yeah, figure out your sexuality. Well, they can't.
Right.
They've never been guided. They have no parameters. And all they have is this mass global corporate abuse
Yeah.
that has been heaped upon them. They don't have the tools to even navigate through that. So what comes off as callous is very, very rarely do people think pornography is wrong, is become mainstreamed. And so we're like, well, we've become callous. I'm like, or we've mainstreamed abuse.
Yeah.
This is no different than the turn from the 18th to the 19th centuries, from the 1800s to 1900s, when we put children in factories.
Yep.
It was abusive, but millions of them worked in factories.
Right.
The culture, and then globally, we had to step up and say that is actually wrong and unhealthy for the development of a child. So we enacted labor laws.
Yeah.
Right? This is no different than the Romans who practiced exposure. If they had a baby they didn't want, they would leave it outside. And if it died in the elements, they would deem it unworthy. If it lived, they would deem it worthy. Well, along the way, culturally, we shifted and said, wait a minute, children are something to be protected, not something to be exposed. It's the same issue where there's corporate powers, there's governmental powers, there's powers that be that are saying, no, this is good and this is healthy, and I'm strong, I guess, and saying, no, it's abusive is what it is.
Yeah.
Now, the kid who is struggling with their sexual identity is not a jerk, and they're not wicked, and they're not evil. They're abused.
Yeah.
And so I think where the church has to be corrected is we have looked and said, 25 years ago when pornography started to become so readily available, as the internet became so readily available, we would say, you're a 30-year-old man who got into porn, you should be disciplined. And there's some credibility to that because that was an act of rebellion.
Right.
To look at a 15-year-old who's searching for, a 7-year-old who's searching for games to play on internet or searching things on YouTube, and people are intentionally cross-pollinating words so that porn will be introduced.
Right.
That's abuse.
Yeah.
So what would have been a corrective thing 25 years ago, disciplinary thing 25 years ago, how could you have gone and so willfully found these things, now becomes a burden that must be borne with someone who has been abused, and it must be a grace that must be given to someone who's struggling with their sexual identity.
Yeah.
So I just think we have to put the foundation of it down wrong. Like I said, I don't know if I agree with 25% or not, but I agree it's absolutely rising because we're seeing the harvest of this storm that we've sown. I think the questioning their sexuality is the big thing.
Yeah.
Because I think even in a non-abusive world that I would have grown up in, you still question your sexuality, and that may be same gender attraction. That may be just like what's happening in my body. That may be me trying to figure out, when I love a friend, does that mean that I'm sexually attracted to them?
Correct.
All of that is relatively normal and historical. You throw all of that into this abusive situation that we've created, that's where this massive confusion comes from. And that's why people who are struggling with same-sex attraction, struggling with sexual identity, more than anything, they're hurting. And they're frustrated, and they're scared, and they're unsure, and they need to be... And because they're coming from a place of woundedness, and so we need to engage them with grace and truth through compassion, because think of them as a child who's been abused.
Yeah, that's so good when you put that foundation down and you realize that's a huge part of what's going into all of this. on top of all of the surface level things that we can look at. Like we talked about this on a past episode of like the rapid culture changing, where 20 years ago, your parents could say, hey, don't watch Will and Grace because it's the show that normalizes homosexuality. Where now every show does that. Everything in our culture plays. You can't watch a movie now without seeing it, or a TV show, or listen to music. And so when you have that understanding of the wound that you're talking about, and I think accurately so, on top of the normalization of all of this, then when students who are already processing, who am I, what's my identity, what do I think, and how do I feel, and how do I connect those two, where we're even in a culture where we're led by our emotions as facts, man, then you can kind of zoom out and see like, okay, now I'm starting to see how this all plays into each other.
Yeah, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And where I feel strongly, and like I said, I get kickback for this, so I just feel strongly it's predatory. And because you are feeding into a wound. If a child was raised in a violent home, we as a culture would not believe that them ingesting violence is healthy for them because they're wounded. They don't have the ability to process it.
Yeah.
If they were raised in a home in which you were unable to the family's unable to provide, so they're raised in hunger and poverty. We would not look at them and say, now that you have eating issues, what we're going to drive you toward is we're going to show you things and examples that we will put in a positive light of people who are anorexic, or their food insecurity, and so they overeat. We're not going to look and say who you should hang out with are everybody who has a 600-pound body mass, and we're going to glorify that.
Right.
We would recognize that where they struggle and what that abuse or neglect or wound is, we need to feed in the things that bring healing to that, not feed in the things that amplify it and then say, now build your whole identity off of that.
Yeah.
But when it comes to sexual issues, we do the exact opposite, because we will take sex abuse and call it freedom. We'll take sex abuse and say, this is manhood, this is womanhood. We'll take sex abuse and say, well, this is the breaking. You're naturally this way. I'm like, that's never ever been true.
Right.
Never ever have cultures looked and said, except the extreme versions that we would have always said are unhealthy, the child bride, the child sacrifice. We have always been protective and valued, and if you attacked our children to intentionally wound them, as a culture we would push back on you and say, minimum it's inappropriate, maximum like you're going to prison for it. And you're watching that shift, and then you're seeing people try to live that out as normality or as health, and that's where you watch all the breaks of their mental health and all the rest. Right. So it's I don't think the answer to that is to rail against it. So I don't. If somebody listens to me and weaponizes what I say, I'm going to be really ticked at you. I'm just being blunt about the real problem. I think the answer to that is to infuse compassion and truth. We try to lead, the church tries to lead with truth way more than we try to lead with grace. And so we're like, well, you're wrong, and here's the Bible verses. I'm like, that didn't help anybody. Right. Because if I come to you and say, I'm struggling with drugs or alcohol, and my answer to you is, well, here's the 14 verses of why you shouldn't be drunk on much wine. Right. You didn't help me at all. All you did was condemn me. Right. The first thing you're going to say is, thank you for bringing your struggle to me. The second thing you're going to say is, how can I help you? Yep. The third thing you're going to say is, if you want help, I can take you to people. Celebrate recovery, etc. That will surround you and help you. You're not going to condemn. Right. So I think the church as a whole has this backwards.
Yeah. Jeff, I think a helpful, maybe discerning thing here too is to help us search our hearts on this. Like, as you listen to this conversation, I mean, I'm literally sitting here, I'm uncomfortable because it breaks my heart.
Yeah,
because I'm burdened by it. And I think that's the point. If it doesn't, if hearing the last, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes of this conversation, if it doesn't break your heart, if it does, maybe you have a righteous anger, maybe there's that side of it. But like, if you go to that side of it, like I caution you, like examine your heart, like evaluate, where is that coming from? Do a little prayer and digging in that, like, because I agree with you. I think it should break your heart to the point where you want to be a part of the solution. We
went, when I say we, some of my staff went to a conference for men and women who had struggled with same-sex attraction but wanted to follow Jesus. And so there's some people in our church that have same-sex attraction, but they want to follow Jesus. And so they were like, will you come, a couple of our pastors, will you go to this conference with us so you can try to understand what we're trying to understand? So we're like, yeah, great. Thanks for the invite. So we went, So a couple of guys went to the conference. The stats were fascinating. It was, and I'm not going to get them dead on, so please hear these as estimates, but it was breathtaking. Like 90% of the people who were struggling with same-sex attraction said, if I felt accepted by a church, I would go to it. Now, what was fascinating was this. They did not mean an affirming church. They're like, I'm actually not asking you to not believe what you believe. I'm asking you to not make my struggle the taboo struggle.
Yeah. Don't condemn me.
Don't condemn me. It was like a huge, like 80-90% of them actually grew up with evangelical roots. And so to me, this is a relational issue. When we I don't think the LGBTQ plus community is wondering if the church disagrees with them or not.
Right.
I think that point has been made.
Yeah.
I think what they're wondering is who will love them. And this is what's fascinating. A lot of kids are drawn to that community because they're accepting and loving. And I think that's what the church is supposed to do.
Right.
But they're repelled by the church.
Yeah.
Now, here's what's sad, what people won't say out loud. They're accepting and loving unless you push back against them, and then they will reject you as fast as anybody else will. And the church is the same way. Like, we're accepting and loving until you do something or think something we don't like, and then we tend to expel you. So the people of God have to wrestle with living in the tension of grace and truth.
Yep.
And if you said to me, okay, Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Bogue, how do you do that? I would say to you, I don't know. I would say that right now to me is one relationship at a time. And when I look at Jesus, people who wanted Jesus but were caught in sin were never rejected by Jesus.
Yep.
When you think about this in your own home, you have kids, they're struggling with it. First of all, remember that they are probably questioning. And do you need parameters? 100%.
Yep.
But the relational path is the answer to that. Will that lead them to being and acting the way you want them to? I don't know. I just know that it's the path that we need to take. And we do not and should not apologize in any way, shape, or form for God's design, for God's plan, and for God's direction. But we also should not apologize for God's grace, His compassion, and His mercy. And somehow all of that needs to be represented in us. Yeah. So I think we can talk factually, like this sex abuse. It just is true. Like let's quit talking around that.
Yep.
It is what it is, but it frames a Christ-centered reaction to someone, and that is equally true and should be valued as well.
Jeff, you started to go there a minute ago, like for the parents or even pastors. I know we've probably both had this. I have many times when a child or a student comes to you and they're coming out, they're saying, "Hey, mom and dad, hey, pastor, I'm I'm wrestling with same-sex attraction, or I think I'm gay, I think I'm homosexual. What's your response? How do you walk with them through that process?
My first response to them is, number one, I love you. Thank you for telling me. Number two, I don't think you being gay is the biggest issue in your life. So if we can set that aside as the biggest issue in your life, because I don't think me being heterosexual is the biggest issue in my life. And I am super heterosexual, right?
Right.
So like, it seems to me, if you're struggling with sexual attraction, I'm struggling with sexual attraction. So the biggest issue in your life is not your attraction. The biggest issue in your life is where you find your identity. Can we talk about that? And why are you scared, or why is it hard for you to have faith to find your identity in Christ? And when you get to that conversation, now you're talking. When you land on Mom, Dad, I'm gay. Okay, here's the 5 points of why you shouldn't be. You've accomplished nothing.
Right. And even
that, because what that is, that's like looking at me and saying, Jeff, you're heterosexual, right? Right. Okay, here's 15 verses of why you should not think lustful thoughts or look lustfully at other women besides your wife. Okay?
Yep.
I'm not sure that I knew those.
Right. Got me.
Bear a burden with me. And like, let's talk about like what's driving the heart, what's driving those addictions, what's driving that attraction. And then you get into the real conversation. And if a person has a hard heart, you can't talk to them about anything. But if they have a soft heart and they're just being open, you can process those things on deep, deep levels. And what you're going to find with a soft-hearted person is you're always going to find pain, you're always going to find wounds, you're always going to find a story. Now, they can let their heart harden, and there's not a thing in the world you can do about it, but they can run into a soft heart of somebody who loves them and will journey with them. And I'm just passionate about this. If you are a confessed sinner, you are exactly the person Jesus is looking for.
Right.
If you come at him and say he's a jerk or he's wrong, like he's always going to be like, I'm not even talking to you. Like, forget it. But if you're like, I'm struggling, there is no taboo sin for Christ to struggle with. Ideally, if you're struggling, you're hurting, you're wounded, the very first people who should know is the church.
Right.
Because ideally, you're loved and accepted where you are.
Yeah.
And at a minimum, we can have the real conversations that maybe helps you get to the heart of Christ instead of the agenda of Jeff.
I love that too, because I think that applies universally. If you have a student, a child, a friend, somebody that comes to you and they say, hey, guess what? I figured out I'm gay, and they're like delighted in it. They're proud in it. And it's not presented as a like, I'm wrestling. This is a thing that I'm making a big deal. If they're presenting it as like, I figured it out, the same principle even applies. Like, hey, why is that your identity? Why is that why are you so pronouncing it pridefully? Like, is there room to get to the heart of the issue? Like, are you hard-hearted or soft-hearted?
Standing and screaming at people is ignorant. It accomplishes absolutely nothing. What Jesus would do is he would lovingly tell you the truth, and then he would say, if you want to hear it, hear it. If you don't, don't.
Yep.
And then he would walk on. Sometimes those people who said, we don't want to hear it, came back later and said, actually, we do. And then Jesus would tell them what was going on, but he would not pick a fight. So this is politics. This is social media. This is the argument over the table at Thanksgiving. Like, don't have it.
Yeah.
And if I read the book right, I'm pretty confident that I do. If my worst enemy comes to me and needs me to love them, I'm to love them. So like this, these like the gay kid needs a hug from a dad. I'm like, they probably do. Now, are you going to go to the Pride Parade and do that? I'm like, I don't know. If you're going on mission or whatever, you have to think through what you're affirming, what you're not, the statement you're making. But I'm like, I'm not going to be that guy. Now, if my daughter's friend is a boy and decides that they're a girl, they're not sharing a room with my daughter.
Right.
Are they banned from my house? No, because sinners aren't banned from my house. I would never be able to enter my house.
Right.
So there are parameters, and people do push us in the corners, but I'm like, for me in my house, I'm not doing that. But I don't affirm. I'm not affirm in the political sense because I believe in truth.
Right.
Me and my church, we're not doing that.
Yep.
But we're also like we're gonna tell you the truth, but in love. Mm-hmm. You're responsible to do with it what you do with it. Me telling you the truth is not me raising my voice, and it's not me telling you the truth 50 times.
Yep.
Once you know it, you know it. Now we're working on a relationship. So now what you're doing is you're rejecting a relationship with me, or you're embracing it, which is exactly what happens with Jesus.
Yes. And those conversations are probably not happening on social media.
No.
They're not name calling.
No, do not say things.
Exactly.
It's the most horrible thing in the world.
But Jeff, I like that because it's not a one size fits all. It's not a like, this is the playbook or here's the blueprint to navigate this. It's not a like, do this in every situation. It's messy. It's challenging. It's tricky.
It's people.
And
it's
have
also
to love
not a
well.
surrendering of the truth. So I know exactly what's happening right now. Like a bunch of people are listening to this, and half of you are like, Bogue went liberal. And I'm like, nope, you're not going to find a guy who's stronger on theology and doctrine than this guy is. And then half of you are like, Bogue's a right winger. I'm like, nope. I hope you don't find a guy who's more graceful, merciful, compassionate, patient than I am. So suddenly you're going to be like, what camp's he in? I'm like, I'm in the Jesus camp. I don't care about your politics, and I don't care about your statement.
Yep.
I am not called to save a country. I'm called to build a kingdom. And when I look at my Savior deal with sinners, what I see is grace and truth and messy, messy situations. He was criticized on both sides.
Yep.
How dare you hang out with that tax collector? How dare you hang out with those notorious sinners? That's a quote in the Bible.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not trying to be self-righteous.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is I don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
If I'm gonna reflect Christ, I do not. Please trust my heart. I'm not trying to be self-righteous. If I'm trying to follow Jesus' example, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And it was super messy all the time. And people got mad at Jesus because he told them the truth, and they got mad at Jesus because he was full of grace and mercy. And I'm like, I guess you just live with people mad at you.
Yeah.
But I think when Jesus says people will hate you because of me, it's for that. It's not because of right wing or left wing stances, because they're both wrong.
Yeah.
And I just think I'm passionate about this because this is the conversation of the next generation.
Yeah.
And if the church and Christ followers don't position themselves in a place of love and truth, grace and truth, like Jesus did, who was full of grace and truth, the scripture says, then we're way out of whack with it. And it's not the first time. We had to do this with slavery. We had to do this with women's rights. We had to do this with child labor. We had to do this with the Reformation. We had to do this with the Roman Empire. This is what we do.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is just, we're the church right now. This is the thing that we have to figure out. And I think our Lord Jesus actually sets a pretty clear example for us that looks like a messy mix of grace and truth.
I mean, the flip side of that is Jesus also even said, "Woe to you when all men speak well of you." Like, so it is messy. It is very challenging. All right, Jeff, we're running out of time. One kind of last technical question in this, like, as you navigate, as you find the people who are open, they're soft-hearted, as you said, and they're wanting to have this conversation, how do you navigate that discipleship pathway? What does that process look like for people who are identifying this is an issue for me? I do love Jesus. I do want to figure this out. What are some practical things that you're taking them through?
I'll give you 3 things, ready? Number 1, know their story. Number 2, know their story more. Number 3, know their story more and more. Discipleship starts by understanding the disciple. And when people feel loved, they will allow you to lead them. When they don't feel loved, they will not trust you and they will resist them. So abused people struggle the most with trust. Now, what's interesting is once they trust, they tend to be extraordinarily loyal because they trust so few people. And put down your agenda and pick up their heart. Ask the Holy Spirit to guide the process, and when it's time, you infuse truth, and when it's time, you infuse grace, and God, the Holy Spirit, guides that process. You do not.
Yeah.
But quit, please, I'm begging you, quit approaching people with an agenda, and know their pain and know their life and enjoy them and love them. And those who are soft-hearted will open up and become teachable, and those who are not won't.
Right.
At least maybe not right then.
Yeah.
It also strikes me, I've been a pastor for 30 years, it strikes me how many people swing back around. But start there and get this off of social media, out of politics, out of agenda, out of save the culture, and one disciple of Christ looking at a lost person or a wandering person and saying, I'm willing to be a shepherd, a father, a mother, a help.
Yep.
So it makes me want to cry. I get really, really passionate about this because I when Jesus saw people, he saw lost and hurting people who were wandering like sheep without a shepherd. That's who he saw. And when he said, look at the harvest is plentiful, he was talking about those people. The gospel is such low-hanging fruit in this world if we can get through the barriers of culture and Christian subculture and just get into each other's heart. The gospel and the hope, the power of change, everything they're looking for is found in the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But you have to earn the right of that relationship. And by the way, my experience, not the activists, they got an agenda.
Right.
The normal person is wildly open to that relationship if they can trust you.
Yep. So good. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing your heart. I hear that coming through. I appreciate you being vulnerable and willing to share that perspective with us. This is really good. So as you're wrestling with this, to our listeners, as you're thinking of your loved ones or somebody that you know in this, we want to be a resource to you. We want this to be helpful, to point you in the right direction. Start in prayer. Pray, think through, how can God use me in this situation, in this individual's life, and remember some of the principles that were shared here. So thanks so much for tuning in to another Momentum episode.
Well, guys, I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'd be really honored if you went ahead and subscribe to the podcast, and that way you can just kind of stay up to date with the episodes that we're posting in the future. To learn more about Momentum Ministry Partners and our many other resources, please be sure to follow us on social media at Momentum Ministry Partners, or check out our website, www.buildmomentum.org.